In this video, I'm going to show you the hidden root cause of anxiety and the solution I discovered which allowed me to overcome over 10 years of anxiety without taking any medication whatsoever. Now, before I get into explaining what the hidden root cause of anxiety is, let me explain what I mean when I say anxiety. I'm not referring to the minor feeling of worrying about something or the feeling of anticipating something that you don't want to happen. I know that's something we'll experience, throughout life. That's a normal part of life. When I'm referring to anxiety, I'm referring to chronic anxiety, where it starts to overtake a person's life and it completely controls everything that they do. So this is something I experienced for over 10 years, and it kind of ruined everything in my life, to be honest. But once I discovered what the hidden root cause was and the solution to overcoming it, it changed everything. So the kind of anxiety I'm talking about, really, is this. Fear. This is ultimately where it comes from. It's not the hidden root cause, but ultimately chronic anxiety is the constant state of being in fear. For example, if someone has social anxiety, then ultimately what they're doing is they are fearing social interactions. Ultimately, when someone who has chronic anxiety, also known as general anxiety disorder, when they're in that state of fear, their fight or flight mechanism in their body is triggered and is constantly triggered all the time. Sometimes it can be difficult to see why it's being triggered as well. So what happens when someone's fight or flight response is triggered? And for those who don't know, the fight or flight response is triggered when your mind and your body, or I should really say your mind, identifies there to be a threat of some kind. So it then prepares your body to be able to fight that perceived threat or to run away, the flight aspect of this, right? So choose to run or choose to fight. And so it prepares your body by producing things like cortisol in your body and other chemicals as well, other hormones. So there is a body response, but we also have an emotional response as well. And so the emotional response is usually felt by a sometimes tightness in the muscles, especially in the chest or in the stomach. Sometimes we also get what we can call butterflies, like a tingling sensation around our body. You can also have tightened muscles, sometimes the shoulders go up. And then the third aspect of experiencing anxiety is in their thoughts. So when someone has anxiety, they'll notice that they start having racing thoughts. Their thoughts go on a constant loop, thinking about the thing they're trying to avoid. They sometimes start imagining catastrophic situations, which only make them more anxious. They may have negative self-talk. So you have three different areas where you have body stress, you have emotional stress, and you have mental stress, so in the thoughts. So that's a general idea of what someone who has anxiety will experience. So the real question is why? Why is it that some people end up having anxiety and some people don't? Why is it some people have constant anxiety and effectively live in anxiety, and then other people don't really get that, or they recover very quickly? So to answer that question, we need to understand the mind. But we need to understand it in a slightly different way. This is the approach that I use. This is the model that I've used for many years, and it's consistently worked. So we first need to understand that there are two main parts to our minds. We have the conscious mind, and we also have the subconscious mind. So the conscious mind is what we are used to calling our mind. This is the part of us where we do our actual thinking. So when you can hear yourself in your mind speaking, which is what we call, I guess, a train of thought. Whenever you have images popping in your mind, when you're visualizing something, that's happening in your conscious mind. When you are remembering something, when you're calculating something, that's all happening in your conscious mind. So you're you're actively taking part in the thinking. The subconscious mind is the complete opposite, and it's also hidden from you almost completely. The things that happen in the subconscious mind happen automatically. So all the things that you don't have to actively think about, like your heart pumping, your breathing, your blinking, all the other body processes going on in your mind, all of that is in your subconscious mind. So you don't have to think about all of that, which is great. It also governs your habits as well. So you don't have to think when you walk, you don't have to think when you're writing something or when you're talking. It just happens automatically, right? And the reason for that is because it works on one of the major principles it works on is repetition. So it works on repetition. So this means that the more you repeat an action, the more it becomes automatic and becomes a habit. So you don't have to think about it anymore. The other principle it works on is that it remembers absolutely everything that you've experienced, literally everything. So any information that came from your senses, so everything you've seen, everything you've heard, everything you've touched, all the sensations you felt, every taste you've experienced, from all the senses, all of that gets stored in the subconscious. So all your memories are actually still in your mind, in your subconscious. You just may not have direct access to get them back. And this is why, for example, we can completely forget certain memories when we're younger, and then maybe much, much later we can have a memory becoming triggered from the past. Because it's always there, it's all there. This is an important thing to remember, that everything you've experienced is still in your subconscious mind. So remember that. So this is where ultimately anxiety comes from. The fact that your subconscious mind remembers everything. It also works on repetition. We also have to remember that the main function of the mind is for your survival. That's the whole point of your mind, to ensure that you survive. So, it remembers everything. Everything you repeat goes into the subconscious and becomes automatic. The main function of the mind is survival. This means that ultimately it's making sure that you avoid pain. And so, when we experience anxiety, ultimately, it is a way to warn us of potential threats, but especially this is entirely based on the threats it remembers from the past, or things that you've been told are dangerous, to avoid pain. So if you've experienced, let's say, physical pain from the past from something, then understandably, if it was very traumatic, your subconscious is definitely going to remember that. And so if it thinks, if it perceives that threat might come back again, then it's going to warn you and it's going to trigger the fight or flight response. So it'll make you feel scared, so you stay away from it. Now, this is where it gets interesting, you see, because this is the next thing to understand. So we have the fact that it remembers everything. Its main function is survival. It works on repetition, so it's not just the habits you create, but the experiences you have over and over and over again that also enter the subconscious mind. So, if you were to experience the same threats over and over and over again, it's going to remember that significantly. And so it will be looking out for that threat, and in anticipation of it, you'll start to feel anxiety. But the more you experience repetition of something, the more you repeat something, it becomes hardwired in your brain. So your brain will actually change in accordance with this new habit, with this new repeated experience. And this is what's known as neuroplasticity. So this means that your brain has the ability to alter itself. So I don't mean it completely changes, but it has the ability to write new programs in your mind. So it has the ability to create new connections in your mind. So this is how habits are formed. The more you repeat an action, it becomes easier and easier and easier over time, because your brain has consistently created those new connections over and over and over again. So the next times you do it, it doesn't take as much effort for your brain to perform the action, because it's already made, let's say, a shortcut in its neurotransmitters to be able to do the action much more efficiently. So this is why some things you've done many, many times you don't have to think about anymore, because your brain is now hardwired to just do it. If you think about your morning routines, for example, if you've done it so many times, you kind of switch on autopilot, right? And you just do it without thinking. Or if you take the same routes on particular journeys, let's say to work, your brain kind of switches off, right? And you kind of go in this autopilot mode, and then you don't have to think about what you're doing. Because you've done it so many times, your brain has created neural pathways for that. So it's very quick, very easy. It's automatic now. It's a habit in the subconscious. Now, one way of looking at this is, it's not just physical actions and physical pain that the subconscious mind, or the mind in general, will warn you about through anxiety, through fear. There are other kinds of pain as well. It's not just physical pain. There's emotional pain as well, and there's mental pain. Now, this is more abstract, but I think emotional pain, we can all understand what that is. So let's say, for example, someone has consistently experienced bad relationships, especially during childhood. You can see now, with this understanding, why they would experience anxiety. Because in the same way that if someone's body kept experiencing physical pain for something, then they're going to feel anxiety in anticipation of it if they see evidence that it could come again. That makes sense. That's the survival mechanism kicking in, the fight or flight response. But it also happens with emotional pain. So let's say in childhood somebody consistently experienced bullying, for example. Let's say then, as a survival mechanism, it's entirely possible that an association was made that certain groups of people, or maybe people in general, are the threat, not because of physical body pain, but because of the potential for emotional pain. This can also happen for what I would call mental pain. I know this is a bit more abstract, even more than explaining emotional pain. Mental pain is somewhat connected to emotional pain, but with mental pain, it's more to do with a more subtle type of pain where, let's say, for example, somebody experiences racing thoughts. That in and of itself is an unpleasant experience, so that's a type of pain. Or let's say somebody starts to doubt themselves. That also is a type of unpleasant experience too, so it's a type of pain as well. So it's entirely possible, and I've experienced in the past as well, where you can become anxious off your own thoughts, because your thoughts, let's say somebody has a very negative they have very negative self-image. They may have intrusive thoughts that say horrible things about them, and it's an unpleasant experience, so it's a type of pain. And so sometimes your own thoughts can trigger anxiety because it's a type of pain, and your mind, let's say you've repeatedly experienced this over and over again, because of repetition, neuroplasticity, and because the subconscious remembers everything, it's going to trigger the fight or flight response to warn you about the potential experience again of feeling that pain, whether it's physical, emotional, or mental. So I still haven't explained what the root cause is. This is what it is, because ultimately, if we look at the cause and effect of all of these and keep going backwards, we will find that ultimately it's rooted in this. Distrust. But it's not just generally distrust. It's a deep-rooted subconscious distrust. So, as I explained before, when you repeat something enough times, it becomes a habit in the subconscious. But that's more for, habits are more to do with the body, and it's more to do with physical habits. There are such things as mental habits and emotional habits. So when you think something or feel something together over and over and over again, it ends up becoming a belief. So it becomes a belief in the subconscious. This is another way of saying it's like a mental habit. So, if someone's had experiences where they've consistently experienced, let's say, physical pain from a source, emotional pain, or mental pain, usually these two are connected. Of course, the mind is going to remember everything. This has been repeated. Through the repetition and neuroplasticity, it becomes a belief in the subconscious. This means that because of the constant experience of these types of pain, there will be a subconscious belief in distrust. And that is the root cause, that is the hidden root cause of anxiety. A subconscious belief in distrust. Or I should say, a subconscious belief in distrusting. Sometimes it can be people, sometimes it can be the world, it can be the person themselves. So it's easy to see with this understanding why something like social anxiety will exist. If someone, let's say, had consistently bad experiences with people in general, with their family, maybe they didn't make friends, maybe people in general have just not been nice to them. Maybe they weren't taught how to socialize properly, or they weren't tuned into the social etiquettes and, the way people act around each other. And so because this would have caused repeatedly over and over again emotional pain and mental pain, maybe even physical pain if there's bullying, the subconscious can remember everything because it's been repeated. Due to neuroplasticity, it becomes a mental habit, a subconscious belief, and that belief is to distrust people, a deep-rooted distrust of people, because they would have consistently been a source of that pain. And of course, it's going to trigger anxiety now every time they go and are around people, even if it's subtle anxiety, because their mind is going to try to make sure they survive so they don't feel that pain anymore. So think about any type of anxiety that you may have or somebody you know has. There is going to be somewhere a deep distrust of something. So if you don't fear something, you trust it to a certain degree. Or even if you don't trust, let's say, certain groups of people, if you trust yourself enough, then you'll be able to not feel the anxiety because you trust you'll be able to deal with the situation. So let's say, for example, somebody feels anxiety every time they're going to work or to school. Just think about that as an example. This means that the school itself or the workplace itself in some way creates pain. It could be emotional pain, it could be, mental pain, thoughts. It's an unpleasant experience that's unpleasant enough that it triggers a fight or flight response to a certain extent. And this is the key here, that it's not just about physical pain, but these two as well, emotional and mental. So it makes sense then if somebody is, let's say somebody's constantly getting nervous and anxious every time they go to work. There's going to be some area in their work, something in their work, where because they've experienced pain now, there's a deep distrust with it because of the pain it's caused them to experience. So to recap, the hidden root cause of anxiety is ultimately a subconscious belief in distrusting something. And that something could be other people, could be the world, could be themselves, could be a mixture of all of these things. There is always going to be something that their mind is trying to help them to avoid because it causes them pain. So it's triggering the fight or flight response, fear response, so that they can survive. Because pain ultimately is going to potentially mean something worse could happen. Because the subconscious mind remembers everything and it works on repetition and neuroplasticity, if you've experienced either physical, emotional, or mental pain repeatedly from similar or the same sources over and over and over again, it will remember that. The repetition creates a subconscious belief to remember that that particular thing you cannot trust anymore because it's causing you pain. And so it will constantly trigger the fear response so that you stay away from it so you can survive. Okay, so now we move on to the solution now that we understand the hidden root cause of anxiety. So this is generally the general points that I used to overcome over a decade of anxiety without any medication whatsoever. So the first thing to do is to, I know it sounds strange, and I know it sounds obvious, but not many people necessarily do this. You need to accept the situation for what it is. So accept that that's the experience that you're having, that you're experiencing chronic or long-term anxiety. The reason you need to do this is because the more you resist it, the more it persists. So the more you deny you have anxiety, the more it actually will get worse over time. But you may not even notice it's getting worse because it's such a subtle change. But you may not notice that it's actually getting worse because it will only gradually get worse as time goes on and you won't notice it. Also, I feel sometimes a lot of people cannot accept that they're experiencing anxiety because it's seen as a weakness, and sometimes they see it as there's something wrong with them. But as we've seen, once we understand how anxiety is formed, there's actually nothing wrong inherently with experiencing chronic anxiety. There's a very good reason why it's there. Once we understand it, it can feel like there's something wrong, especially when we use terms like disorder to describe it. That's why I prefer not to use the word disorder to describe these kind of things. Technically, when you think about it, it's not a disorder because your mind is doing precisely what it's meant to do. It's protecting you as best as it can based on the information it's constantly received. It's actually better to call it an adaptation. So really it's an anxiety adaptation. That's what I believe we should start calling these things. So to understand where that repetition occurred, to understand at what point did your subconscious mind see something, whether it's physical, emotional, or mental, as a threat. Like where was their pain? Where was their emotional pain as well? That's often what it is. So you need to look into your past, and this is where therapy of different types is extremely useful. I've used this myself many, many times. And I know this is something that people often actively avoid as well, which is why accepting the situation you're in, accepting that you're experiencing anxiety is the first step. Once you accept it, you need to understand why you're experiencing this anxiety. So either you can look into the past or you can work with a therapist who are qualified to help you explore your past to understand and make sense of it. Because once you understand where the anxiety comes from, why it's there, then you can begin to understand how to reverse the situation. So for example, for me personally, I looked at, and I think everyone should do this, look at your childhood first and foremost. Were there any particular experiences that could have caused, it doesn't have to be physical pain, but did they cause emotional pain as well? And this is sometimes harder to spot. So for example, did you experience lots of rejection in your life? Is that the meaning that you were assigning to experiences as a kid, which is natural to assign that meaning to an experience? So let's say you have somebody who consistently experienced rejection or abandonment, for example. And then let's say when they grow up, when they're older, they get into relationships, and now the way they act in the relationship is that they're terrified of losing the person, and there's anxiety around that. Well, it makes sense now, because if in the past they experienced huge amounts of rejection, or let's say a consistent amounts of rejection, and it can be a subtle thing, like maybe their parents didn't really connect with them consistently, that can be interpreted as a form of rejection. And so the subconscious mind remembers, well, I'm experiencing this pain, this is bad. Oh, it keeps happening from this particular type of person. Maybe then they get into a relationship with somebody like their parents, and this triggers the anxiety. So, and we'll get on to triggers in a bit as well. But the quickest way of, in the moment, helping to reduce anxiety is breathing techniques. And I'm sure people have heard this before. But it's the way that you breathe that's really, really important. It's something so simple, we all, well, I hope you all do this, I hope we all breathe. It's not just deep breathing. There are many, like hundreds and hundreds of breathing techniques. But the ones I found work best for anxiety are, it's not just deep breath in. You want to make sure your breath out is actually longer and deeper than the breath in. And this is because of, so our nervous system is split into two parts. So we have the autonomic nervous system, and it's split into two parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is designed for everything related to stress. So when you're experiencing anxiety, your sympathetic nervous system is switched on, and it's designed to focus on survival in the moment. The other side to it, so the parasympathetic nervous system, is focused on all the other times, so when you're relaxing. So it's focused on making your body focus on relaxation. So breathing techniques is the way you relax your body, because it shifts your body back into using the parasympathetic nervous system. So it primes your body back into being in the relaxed mode. Interestingly, when you breathe in, that somewhat uses the sympathetic nervous system. It's a slight stress. So when you're under stress, you're using the sympathetic nervous system more. And when you breathe out, because it's relaxing, you're letting go, it's not stressful. You're actually using the parasympathetic nervous system, which is for relaxation. So what you want to do is build up a rhythm, a repetition, so you can see how this links into the subconscious mind. You'll notice that when people are chronically anxious, even if it's subtle, notice how you're breathing. This is a good practice. Throughout the day, notice your breathing. Are you relaxed? Is it deep and calm? Or is it short? And that will give you a clue as to which nervous system that you're using at the time. And if you discover, hey, I have very short breaths, you probably might be experiencing low-level anxiety and not even realizing it. So the type of breathing I recommend, and this should be a habit that you do throughout the day so it becomes something you can switch on whenever you need to, is so you breathe in through your nose for about 4 seconds, hold it for 2 or 3 seconds, and when you breathe out, make it like 7 seconds. So you breathe in, then you hold it, then so that's like 7 seconds, and then you can hold it again for 2-3 seconds and repeat. You don't have to do this through breathing out through your mouth. You can do it through the nose as well, but it's through the consistency of doing this. You'll notice gradually over time it's a lot easier to manage in the moment the symptoms of anxiety. Okay, so that then brings on to the next point, which is triggers. So when your anxiety gets triggered, and I know that for some people it's a constant thing, but when it gets really triggered, try to notice if there are patterns in what's triggering it. This can be difficult. For some people it's obvious, maybe a particular person triggers anxiety, or maybe their workplace or their school triggers anxiety. So that's sometimes obvious, but sometimes it's a lot more subtle and it's really not obvious. And that's when, if it's not obvious, that's usually because it's something emotional or psychological, like a psychological pain or an emotional pain that's being remembered in the moment from the past. And so you're being triggered, the anxiety is being triggered because of the past experiences. Because remember, there's a belief now in the subconscious mind. So your mind is warning you, is recognized, oh, this is like that thing that happened in the past that caused us pain. Let's trigger the fight or flight response. So it can be very subtle. Like, for example, let's say you're in a group of friends, and let's say you say something to someone, and let's say they don't hear it and they carry on talking. And let's say all of a sudden you start feeling anxious. This can happen to people. And it might seem bizarre, like, why does that make me anxious? That makes no sense. But it does. What if, and I used the example previously, what if that is perceived by a part of you as rejection? And what if in the past, being rejected, let's say as a kid, meant some kind of pain, like emotional pain, for example? That understandably then will trigger anxiety because it's anticipating a possible emotional pain that came from the past, but instead it could happen now in the present. Let's say, for example, another one. Let's say someone doesn't receive a message back from someone and they start getting anxious. It could be that in the past something similar happened where they were, again, let's say there was an abandonment issue, for example. Maybe they were abandoned in some way as kids, like emotionally abandoned. Not receiving a message back by text for a long time can trigger anxiety because it's, again, anticipation of the really painful emotions that would have happened when they were younger. This is triggering their anxiety because, again, it's trying to help them to survive by avoiding pain. So look for your triggers and see if you can notice a pattern, because at times it will seem like there is no pattern, but look for emotional patterns. You also want to notice what's going on in your mind. Sometimes our own thoughts can trigger anxiety. So if you notice that you're constantly thinking of the worst situation that could happen about something, probably going to make you anxious, right? Because your body now thinks, oh no, this could happen. Okay, I'm gonna trigger the anxiety now to warn you about it. So watch your thoughts as well, not just your emotional response, but your mental response. Are you responding to a situation by thinking of the worst catastrophic event that could happen? Think about that. And that's why you need to observe your thoughts. That's the next point. Your thoughts have so much more power than most people realize. When you start thinking of something over and over and over again, you generate emotion from that. Like you can right now think of your own perfect paradise, like your own perfect situation. And if you focus on that enough, you'll start feeling better. You can also do the exact opposite. You can start thinking negatively about yourself, about a situation, about people. It's not going to make you feel good. Again, so the key here is to understand that your thoughts can trigger emotions, which includes anxiety. So that's why you need to learn to observe your thoughts. This is what's known as mindfulness. So it's understanding that you are not your thoughts. Your thoughts are a tool that you use to interact with the world. So, well, your body is what you use to interact, but your thoughts are also involved as well. So when you have a thought coming in, you don't have to believe it. If you have a thought coming in of, oh no, this is the worst case scenario could happen, question it. Treat it like it was a person giving you an opinion. You don't have to accept it and you don't have to believe it. Look at it, and if you realize, oh, I recognize now I'm thinking of the worst case scenario that's making me feel anxious. Don't push the thought away, that only makes it come back. Instead, just observe it and focus on something else. Don't even pay attention. And through that repetition of doing this, there's repetition again, it will become more and more automatic. It will become a subconscious habit. So then you'll notice if you stop giving energy to those thoughts that make you feel anxious, focus on more balanced thoughts. Create more balanced thoughts that say, okay, well, yeah, that thing could happen, but it's unlikely. I think, in fact, this positive outcome is what I would prefer to happen. Focus on that. Just by that one thing, you'll notice a lot of people can reduce huge amounts of anxiety because a lot of it can come from the mind, and it's not their fault. Again, if you've had consistently negative experiences, then it will trigger anxious thoughts and anxious feelings. But it is something that can be managed largely as well through this method. And so if you are having many anxious thoughts and you find you just can't control them, they're running around everywhere, write them down. This is a really unbelievably simple but powerful thing to do. So if you realize there's too much going on in my head, I can't handle it, it's overwhelming, just start writing it down. Get a notebook, get a paper. It's even better if you can make this a habit. So let's say you realize there are 10 things going on in your head that you're worried about. Write them down as honestly as you can. And an interesting thing happens often. When you write it down, it's like you've taken it from your mind and you've stuck it on paper. And with the repetition of this, myself and others who have tried this find you no longer feel you have to keep the thoughts in your mind, because often the reason why we think we have to go over and over again is because we think if we don't think about this, somehow we won't be prepared for that possibility. But ironically, it's not helping you. It's actually making things worse because you're not focused now on the solution. You're focused on worrying about the thing you're trying to avoid. So by writing down what you're worried about, let's say you do need to return to thinking about this thing you're worried about. You can tell yourself, well, if I need to think about this again, I can choose when to come back and to read these thoughts. And because you've written it down, it's a lot easier just to let it go from your mind. So the next thing this is the next thing, which is very powerful, and I haven't really heard people using this often. So you need to look for evidence of how you are safe. So this is essentially the opposite of what the anxiety does. Because if your brain is now wired, if you've had long-term anxiety, and if your brain is now wired to look for threats, you're never going to feel fully safe. Even if you're at home, no one's around, everything's fine. With chronic anxiety, there is still a low level amount of anxiety because your mind is still distrusting certain things because of past experiences, trying to ensure your survival. So what you want to do is, as well as doing all of these things, what you want to do is keep looking every single day repeatedly, daily as a daily practice, for evidence of how you are safe. So you're feeding now your subconscious mind with evidence repeatedly to build a new belief, a new subconscious belief in safety. So you're balancing things out now. So if you've had a subconscious belief in distrust or unsafety, we can say, you're now going to build another one, which is of safety. And so by not feeding the old subconscious belief of evidence how you don't have safety and how you have to distrust things, you're going to do the opposite. So you're starving one subconscious belief and you're feeding, growing another, so it balances it out. Because of course you do still want to be able to recognize when there are genuine things you need to be concerned about. But the thing about anxiety is you end up not focusing on the solutions. That's the key here. So keep looking every day, even if it's minor, look for evidence of safety, and I even recommend writing that down. So while you're writing down your anxious thoughts, you can also write down evidence to counter that, to say, okay, so there's X thing that I'm anxious about. How can I find ways to feel safe in that? How can I find ways to feel safe despite these things I'm anxious about? So with the example of let's say the person who felt anxious when they didn't receive a text back from someone, they could write down their thoughts and then say, well, what's the counter evidence? How is this relationship safe? They'll probably be able to write down many occasions where that person did not abandon them and what the real reason for them not receiving the text was about. But again, the key here is repetition. It won't happen overnight. It may take weeks. It's kind of like going to the gym, right? You won't see results unless you're doing it as a consistent practice. And through doing all these things, ultimately what we're doing is we're not just building trust in the world. What you really want to focus on, the key here, is going to be building self-trust. Because there will always be things in the world that you won't necessarily be able to trust, you won't necessarily feel safe around. That's a reality of reality, right? So the thing that you can build trust with is yourself. Because if you don't have self-trust, you're not going to be able to properly trust your ability to deal with things in the world, and that's where distrust will come from. So as long as you can build self-trust, and you can do this by building evidence of how you are safe around yourself. But you also need to make sure that you don't have habits that are self-sabotaging and are making you lack trust with yourself. So if you have one part of you that wants to move towards your goals, but you have another part of you that self-sabotages, takes you away, that's going to build distrust. And that's also often why we can have our anxious thoughts, because we're worried about what we might do to stop something from happening. So build self-trust, and you can do this by looking for evidence of how you do look after yourself. But as long as you're doing all these things together, I don't think you can do just one. I think it does need to be, at the very least, accepting the fact that you have anxiety, but also not just accepting it, feel the feelings of anxiety. Because often, I guess because we're wired to avoid pain, when we feel things like anxiety or fear, our immediate thing to do is to get away from it as quickly as possible, whether it's distracting ourselves with, food or, TV or something, or mobile phones. Don't resist it. Feel the emotion and fully accept it. Because if you resist it, it just makes it worse. And if you can consistently get into the habit of being comfortable in feeling the anxiety, it holds less power over you. So you can, as you're recovering from this anxiety, you can still go and do things, and you can move from being completely controlled by the anxiety to experiencing less anxiety, and also still being able to do things while experiencing anxiety because you stop resisting it and you feel it and understand it more. But over time, through looking in the past, understanding why you have anxiety, so working with a therapist helps, through understanding your breathing, understanding your triggers, what triggers the anxiety, and again, looking into your past can help you with that. Observing your thoughts. Are your thoughts helpful? Are they making you more anxious? Can you create more positive, balanced ones? Write down your thoughts so you can let go of the anxious thoughts that could be triggering further anxiety. Consistently look for evidence of how you are safe. So if you, for example, are anxious in a relationship, look for evidence of how you are safe and how the relationship is safe. And through doing this, you build self-trust, because not only are you looking after yourself really well by focusing on resolving this, but also you can consistently look for evidence of how you can trust yourself. And if you can't find evidence, if you realize you're self-sabotaging a lot, then that's something you're going to have to work on. And I can do another video at some point about self-sabotage. But there you have it. So that's the root cause. That's the hidden root cause of anxiety. And that's the solution. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.